Okay, we're going to continue kind of talking about the statistics or the math behind recruitment plans. So we talked about in the previous slide um, the need for actually getting information about basically what the current recruitment pool may look like, kind of past history, current trends. And all recruitment plans need to be statistically based. And there's two main things that we're wanting to track and plan for in a recruitment plan. The ratio of leads to hires by position, often referred to as yield ratios, and also then the time between leads and hires, the time lapse data. So if we're looking at a company that is trying to build up a good database to be able to better control their future recruitment, the data they're trying to gather from past hires is this two pieces of information. What was the ratio of the previous hires and what was the time lapse data? So the yield ratios and time lapse. So basically, the first thing we ask is leads. So we want to know each time the company has actually made a job offering available at different levels in different ways, how many total people applied. So this is the leads. So for example, in the example I have here, we have 240 leads. Now, the next question is, of those leads, how many people were actually looked at further? In other words, how many people made it past the first cut? So in this case, we see that 40 people were actually invited in to interview at the company. So whatever selection techniques were being used past initial recruitment, so that initial screening resulted in a ratio of 6 to 1. So this gives us pretty good information. That ratio, that yield ratio, starts to give us information that we can now back calculate for future recruitment purposes. If we know how many people we want to hire, how many people do we need to get into our recruitment pool to make that hire likely? We also want to know time, so how long did it take to actually get those leads? So for the instance, in this case, again, we have 240 applicants at the lead stage, of which 1 out of 6 of them actually made it to the next step. And it took 4 days between when the job opening was listed, the leads were generated, and that initial cut was made. So we move up to the next level. Now, invites. So 40 of those 240, 1 out of 6, were actually brought in for an intervention or an invitation to interview. This process then took about 5 days. So again, we're keeping track of this information for each and every recruitment. Now again, we ask how many of the people that were interviewed were actually given an offer. So again, the invites to offers is a 2 to 1. So for every 2 people that interviewed, 1 person was given an offer. We now look at that further interviews. So of the interviews, we're actually looking at, and I'm sorry, the invites to interviews, what that refers to, I apologize, is 40 people were invited, but only 20 of them accepted the invitation. So we have a 2 to 1 ratio between invites and interviews, and it took 5 days for that process to unfold. Now the interviews, of the 20 people that were interviewed, how many people were actually then made an offer? So again, we have a 2 to 1 ratio. For every 2 people that interviewed, 1 person was made an offer. And this took 3 days of interviewing. That takes us to the offers phase. We now have 10 people with an offer in hand. How many of those accepted, and how long did it take for that acceptance to occur? In this case, 1 out of 5 accepted the job offer, and it took 7 days for that process to unfold, resulting in 2 hires. So the total time at this point then is what we're interested in, and from the time of hire to them actually going onto the job is 21 further days. So what this information gives us is that if we have this yield ratio and time lapse data, we now have statistics and past research to make reasonable assumptions of how long a new search would happen. So for instance, if each HR now said in the same kind of job that this data was from, and it's now a year later, we need to hire 4 more people. HR and recruitment could go back and go, okay, well then we need at least 2 months because we know that it takes 19 days from job post to offers being sent out and accepted from the last research. And it took 21 days from that offer being accepted to someone entering the job. So the first thing we can tell you is that on average, it's going to take at least 40 days. More likely, let's go ahead and go with 2 months between when you tell us you want someone and you actually have someone now working in the company. So that's very useful information. Also, if you know that you're wanting to accept 4 people for this job based on this past recruitment, you also now know we need to generate a leads list of twice what we did last time. We need 480 people to get 80 invites, to get 40 interviews, to get 20 offers, to get 4 acceptances. Now again, this doesn't guarantee that's how it's going to play out, but you're going to be more accurate in your prediction of how long will it take to go from recruitment to hiring, and how many people you need in that initial pool to get the hires you want if you've tracked this information and you use it as a statistical prediction model. So other recruitment considerations, so this is basically, the last slide was existing in a vacuum, assuming that everything else was stable. And of course, that's not the case. You also have to take into account strong economy versus weak economy. So the stronger the economy, the more difficulty it is going to be hiring. A strong economy means more people working, more people getting raises, more people being promoted quickly, more people less worried about losing their jobs. In that situation, there's less people on the job market. Likewise, a weak economy is going to be too many applicants. And what this means is that it'll be very easy to generate an applicant pool, but that applicant pool may actually not have very many qualified applicants compared to previous recruitment programs and plans. The labor market also has to be encountered, not just overall economy, but the economy of the local market, regional, national, and world. All of these do have impacts on recruitment. Also competitors. So if previous data has been generated by a company of basically, again, yield ratios and time ratios, but those were hires done when there wasn't direct competition and there's now someone or another company directly competing, that's going to actually impact. Also, if a direct competitor is no longer in the market, which now means that the company has an easier time attracting qualified applicants, that's going to affect things. We're going to talk a little bit more about the impact of technology, but definitely as technology changes, it also changes recruitment strategies. So basically, any recruitment ratio data that was generated prior to the internet is not going to be very useful at predicting current recruitment plans. And finally, just supply and demand, which is also tied off into the economy. But it isn't necessarily just economy, it also can be educational trends. So how many people are actually looking for the job that have the skill set, and then how many employees are looking for those people. So long-term plan issues for recruitment. Again, recruitment is often looked at as simply a step A to step B kind of get the applicants in and then let the selection process do its work. But there is long-term impact of recruitment plans. So the organization's image is often communicated through recruitment and how recruitment treats applicants. So positive image, organizational appeal, geographic advantages, available housing, school and shopping, cost of living, all of these are things that long-term recruiters need to worry about. So is our organization hiring in areas that are cheaper or more expensive? So anyone trying to do recruitment to get people to come to New York City, for instance, has a unique challenge compared to places in other cities, where New York City has a strong and well-deserved reputation of having a very high cost of living. If you're recruiting for an area where the schools are known to be somewhat bad or have a bad reputation, or you're recruiting for a rural area without much shopping, if you're recruiting for an area where the cost of living, not just cost of living, but being able to find available housing is very expensive. Currently, trying to recruit people in Hawaii can be quite a challenge, not just because of the cost of living, but also there's not a large amount of available good housing in Hawaii anymore. There's been a process where most of the actual real estate has often been bought up by people that just vacation there, and making it very hard to find available good housing. Just geographical advantages and disadvantages, and this can also be person environment fit. And like I said, the organizational appeal. So all of these include the organizational culture profile, so that's the organizational appeal. But our good recruitment plan is also going to be trying to address all of these issues. A good recruitment plan is going to work hand in hand with the actual organizational development of the organization's culture and image, and use that image to help in the recruitment. It's going to try to leverage the geographical, housing, school shopping, and cost of living. If there's problems in this area, it's going to address them directly. So for instance, when I was applying for a job in New York once, I was actually told, you're going to get a very high salary offer, but we also want you to recognize the reason that salary offer is going to sound so large to you is that you need that kind of salary to live in New York. And in fact, even with the salary you're offering, you're probably going to find that you would actually have a slightly lower standard of image or standard of living than you would for a lower salary in anywhere else in the United States. That's again leveraging that disadvantage. They know cost of living is a problem. They've worked with the company to provide a better compensation package, but they're also not trying to surprise people. They're trying to give people a realistic preview of what taking this job is going to be like. I also once applied to a job that was in Texas in a small rural town about 150 miles away from the nearest airport. And they made it very clear in their recruitment plan, again, that this was both an advantage and a disadvantage. That if I was someone that liked being away from the large city, being in a very rural and pastoral environment, that it was a beautiful town, a beautiful area to live, but I was also going to be away from kind of traditional big city conveniences. So other recruiting trends, one of the interesting trends that research has found is that a lot of minority workers still tend to rely on more formal methods. Now again, this is morphing as social media, internet, and online sources become more and more available to a larger group of people in the United States. But it is still true that basically computer savvy and tech savvy is still somewhat tied to social economic status, and a lot of minority status is also tied negatively to social economic status. So selecting a diverse group of organizational contacts and external recruiters. In other words, if you are an organization that is primarily using online techniques to generate applicant pools, a side effect will often be that that applicant pool will be less diverse than if you used more traditional methods, increasing the likelihood of a possible accusation of adverse impact on protected groups. So basically, recruitment often is not just an I-side viewpoint. Recruitment also involves a bit of O-side of looking at social justice issues. How do we create recruitment programs and plans that include the ability to attract minority applicants or protected group applicants? And this includes getting top management support, training for diversity. So again, kind of an organizational-wide commitment to getting the information out to potential job applicants that the company values diversity. Monitoring and revising progress towards those objectives, so actually tracking minority hires, but also the number of minorities that are ending up in the selection pools. And then specific diversity messages given to all applicants is another way to communicate to minority applicants that the company is open to them working there, is going to be a good environment. But again, the choice of methods of generating the actual recruitment pool will often be somewhat guided by these kind of EEOC considerations. So a lot of organizations will still, for example, use professional networks and often specifically ethnic or gender groups. So if you're hiring for engineers, an engineering company may specifically make sure that its job ads are also sent to an organization that focuses on minority engineering students or women engineering or women in STEM organizations to try to make sure that participant pool, that sample of potential applicants, is diverse to begin with. So barriers to successful recruitment for diversity applicants includes a lack of current diversity. So a lot of research has found that minority applicants often look at the current diversity. I know when my wife is on the job market, one of the things she often looks at potential companies is how many women are in leadership positions. And example, for Psychological Associates, when she first went working there, the president was a woman, and she valued that very much as a sign that that company was open to women moving up into upper management. Lack of access to training and development. So if the organization has a reputation for not necessarily developing its employees, a lot of minority applicants are looking for companies that are willing to invest in their professional development. Also, lack of diversity in upper management. So if there is a fair amount of diversity, but again, that diversity does not extend into upper management, these are factors that create barriers, and applicants will be less likely to apply to jobs where they see these kind of red flags. So the management of recruitment is kind of an HR function, but basically it's about recording and controlling applicant flow. And part of this is to create those statistical models, for example, the yield ratio we talked about at the start of this lecture. But it's really mainly about just keeping accurate records. So logging all applications and resumes, keeping track of applicant activity, keeping track of correspondence. And again, there's ripples to these processes, though recruitment at its most basic level is simply generating a large pool of applicants for the selection process then to select and hire. Recruitment also has an important play in the perception of the company through the people that apply. So keeping up good correspondence with not only applicants but also that you're interested in, but also applicants that are going to be rejected. The handling of offers and acceptance. So basically recruitment is considered to be pretty much the entire process, to some degree including selection, up until the person is actually hired in the organization. So how offers are being made is often considered a part of recruitment. And again, keeping accurate records. How many offers were made? How many acceptances? How many of those acceptances involved negotiation? And what was the initial offer and the negotiated final package? And finally, records of closed applications should be kept for a reasonable length of time. Reasonable length of time can often vary depending on legal requirements from state to state and various local municipalities and their legal requirements. But generally, it is a good idea to keep records for 3 to 5 years as just kind of a rule of thumb, as a protection against potential challenges and the need for possibly creating evidence that there hasn't been any adverse impact in the recruitment process. So key metrics to monitor and track out of all this data. Again, we talked about this earlier, the time to hire, so the total time required from initial job posting to someone actually being given the job and starting to work. The quality of hire, so how satisfied an organization is with the hire. And this is something that often gets lost in the tracks, is beyond the initial hire, actually tracking how many people past the recruitment process of the hire actually end up being a top performer in the organization. So how successful was that quality of hire? How long does the person stay with the company? So retention information. Number of vacancies outstanding, so the total number of job vacancies the company has. So how successful is the recruitment process at filling vacancies, and how many vacancies are actually outstanding? There are unsuccessful job hunts. When I was a graduate student at SIUC, the program that I was a graduate student in, the applied psychology program, actually had a faculty search all 5 years I was there. Only 2 of them resulted in a hire. So there were 3 faculty searches that resulted in a vacancy outstanding. There was no one hired for that actual position. Now that might have been in one case where all 3 of the final applicants, the program decided they didn't like any of them and decided not to hire any of them. In other words, all 3 of them came in for a job talk and interviews, and none of them were found to be a good fit. In the other cases, an offer was made, but only one offer was made, and that offer was rejected for another job. And again, there was no other applicants that they were interested in pursuing at that time. Another piece of information that you want to track and keep track of, again, to provide more information and better decision making into the future, is the cost per hire. So how much money was spent to get the hires that were successfully hired? And again, so on the slide we started with the 240 applicants that ended up with 2 hires, if we calculate the entire cost of that process from initial job placement to finally the person taking the job and the end of the process, however much that was divided by 2 is how much it cost to hire that one individual. And the cost for hire across organizations can be fairly expensive. The actual average, national average of a cost per hire is somewhere around $10,000. That most organizations assume that it's going to be about a $10,000 investment to get one person into a job position. And that can definitely fluctuate from being much less for entry-level jobs to much, much more for higher-level jobs. And finally, recruit source effectiveness. In other words, tracking where the actual applicants came from. How many applicants came from job fairs? How many applicants came from professional networks? How many applicants came from referrals from current employees? And how many applicants came from online? This also lets you start to actually put dollar signs, in other words, utility analysis, of is this particular recruitment source worth the money that we're spending on it. So recruitment, successful interviews, just a few things that can influence the success of the recruitment process. So a fair amount of research has been done on what's called a realistic job preview. It means that the recruitment process is not just listing the job from a job analysis. In other words, this is the job and the skills necessary to do well in the job, but also giving information about the geographic pluses and minuses, so the cost of living, putting all this information in, and also giving people an idea of what the job will actually be like once they accept the job. So a realistic job preview can also be done through the actual interview process. And a lot of successful interviews are viewed as being kind of a two-way street where the organization is learning about the individual, but the individual is also learning about the organization. So interviews that give both positive and negatives for any given position enhance negative job aspects and moderate the positives. So that's the first thing is that generally speaking, if we're talking about providing people with realistic information of what it's like to have that job, it does tend to focus the person on the negative job aspects, but moderate the positives. And a lot of research has looked at this and gone, well, shouldn't we just be putting forth the positives? What research has found is that the impact of a realistic job review, or an RJP, is small applicant tendency to withdraw from the process. So that's the first thing we find, is that there actually is a greater tendency for applicants, a small group of applicants, to withdraw from the process at each level. We also find that job acceptance rates are lower. So again, if we looked at that initial model from the first slide from this module, we had 240 applicants at the start that then went down to 80, 40, 20, 10, and then 2, with 2 people being hired. If a realistic job preview was included in that, we would probably assume that that 240 wouldn't go to 80, it might go to 70. And that 70 might not go to 40, it might go to 30. So we would see a larger number of people pulling out from the process as they actually are being given information and realize this may not be a job for me. I mentioned that job down in Texas that gave me the realistic job preview of exactly what it was like to live in that town. I did a phone interview, but at the end of the phone interview, where they did focus on both the positive and the negative aspects of the job, I did pull myself out of consideration. I realized that I like to travel too much, I like to go to the theater, I like to go to concerts, and that being in that small of a town, with literally being about 3 hours from the nearest metropolitan center, just wasn't for me. So I withdrew from the process. Now, the problem for this, though, is that though the job acceptance rates are lower, job performance shows no impact. So when we look at people that actually do accept the job, when an realistic job review was used, we find that they tend to be no better or no worse performers. However, job survival and turnover. Job survival is higher and turnover is reduced. And overall, an organization will spend less time recruiting because though the pool gets narrowed quicker and there's occasionally a smaller number of people that accept the job, those that accept the job, because they knew what the job really was like, they knew both the negatives and the positive, they're much more likely to survive the job. And what that means is to thrive, to perform well, and to grow in that job. And they're also generally less likely to leave. All forms of turnover is reduced. So the realistic job reviews are still not necessarily the norm. And some people do see those early negatives of seeing that impact in the job applicant pool, and especially job acceptance rates, as a big negative. And there has been research that's shown that when people are given a realistic job review, they tend to be more focused on the negative aspects than the positive aspects, especially after an in-person interview. The overall result, though, is a positive one. So generally, how to be recruited. So this is kind of coming out from the other end as you are within a year with the successful completion of your master's degree, going to be on the job market. Some things to be considering when you're thinking about how to get recruited. One is to take your time. Generally speaking, this is broadly good advice that you do not want to necessarily take the very first job offered. You want to be recognizing that you have a good skill set, that you're in a good field to get a job, and that you want to apply to a lot of places. You want to apply to jobs that are a good fit, and you want to be fairly systematic about it. You should be fairly optimistic that you will end up finding good placement, and you also want to be very thorough about defining and describing your skills, abilities, and desire. You want to develop a plan and follow it, and by developing a plan, it's identifying what are your strengths that you can communicate to companies, and what are you looking for in a company, and then using that plan to help guide who you apply to and where you apply to. Be very approachable and develop your contact network, and this is something you'll hear me say over and over again. Use every opportunity to build up your professional network as a graduate student. Reach out to alumni, reach out to the second years. When the first years come in next year, make sure that you make those contacts as well, because this isn't just about creating some friends, it's about creating professional networks in a captured environment. They can't get away from you. It's time to network. And also take advantage of the St. Louis networks. A lot of jobs, and you'll hear this from alumni and you'll hear it from me, most of the jobs that people get are a combination of them finding good fits, of them being able to communicate what skills and abilities they bring, but almost always there's also some element of professional contacts being involved, whether it's a good reference or whether it is someone actually recommending you. Involve your family and keep your friends up to date. So use all of your networks. Let people know what you're looking for and to keep an eye out for jobs. Be truthful in how you're representing yourself. Remember, your introduction letters and or emails that come out with your resume are also being judged. So when you send out a resume, there should be a very well written introduction letter that also helps to make the argument. Think of it as your own little personal statement of why you should be hired for this particular job. A lot of research has found that resumes alone are rarely looked at. It's a combination of a resume and a good intro letter or intro email that generally gets people past the first cutoff. In fact, a fair amount of recruiters tend to ignore resumes that do not come with a decently written introduction letter or email. And also, once you actually get to the recruitment process, let the employer bring up salary first. So a lot of people try to jump to this as one of their very first questions during an interview. So how much is this going to pay? What is the compensation? You generally want to let the actual organization make you an offer and then offer you their initial offer of a salary. Because once they make that salary offer, they are now committed that you're the person that they've chosen to hire, which shifts the power to you. And I'd be glad to talk to any of you about any of these factors in the upcoming years as you hit the job market yourself.